Every parent's worst nightmare is seeing their child return home broken and afraid. Sheriff Caleb Hart had buried 2 children of his own, so when 8-year-old Clara came back from her uncle's ranch with tears in her eyes and terror in her voice, his protective instincts kicked in hard. Clara had always been a bright, happy girl who loved visiting Uncle Marcus on his sprawling ranch outside Cedar Ridge. But something happened during that weekend visit that changed everything. The little girl who left home with a smile came back refusing to speak, flinching at shadows and clinging to anyone who would listen. Her Uncle Marcus was a respected rancher with deep community ties and a clean reputation. So what could have possibly happened at his ranch to leave a child so traumatized? What dark secret was hiding behind the friendly face that everyone in town trusted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Caleb Hart stood at his office window, watching the dust settle on Main Street as the morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge. At 58, he'd worn this weathered badge for 3 decades, through boom times when the railroad brought prosperity and lean years when drought threatened to kill the town entirely. His fingers unconsciously traced the star-shaped metal pinned to his vest, a badge that had seen everything from cattle rustling to claim jumping, from saloon brawls to family disputes that stretched back generations. But nothing in those 30 years had prepared him for what he'd witnessed an hour ago when Clara Whitmore stumbled off the afternoon stage, her small frame trembling like a leaf in a winter wind. The girl's parents, Thomas and Margaret Whitmore, had been beside themselves with worry. They'd sent their daughter for what should have been a delightful weekend with Margaret's brother Marcus, who owned the most successful ranch in the territory. Marcus Whitmore was everything a man aspired to be in Cedar Ridge: prosperous, respected, generous with his church donations, and quick to help neighbors in need. His ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, and his cattle bore the finest bloodlines money could buy. Yet Clara had returned from that paradise, looking like she'd witnessed the end of the world. Caleb's deputy, Tom Bradley, knocked on the doorframe before entering. At 35, Tom had the eager energy of a man still proving himself, though he'd been working alongside Caleb for nearly 8 years. His sandy hair was perpetually mussed from riding, and his earnest, brown eyes held a deep respect for his mentor that sometimes made Caleb feel older than his years. "Sheriff, the Whitmores are here with Clara," Tom said quietly. "Doc Mitchell's with them. Thought you'd want to know before they come up." Caleb nodded, straightening his shoulders. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a specialist in matters involving children. She'd arrived from back east 5 years ago, carrying credentials from fancy medical schools and a gentle manner that put even the most frightened child at ease. If anyone could help Clara find her voice, it would be Sarah. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs outside his office drew Caleb's attention. Thomas Whitmore appeared first, his weathered rancher's face etched with lines of worry that seemed to have deepened overnight. Behind him came Margaret, her usually pristine appearance disheveled, her dark hair escaping its careful arrangement. Between them walked Clara, so small she seemed to disappear in the shadow of the adults. But it was Dr. Mitchell who caught Caleb's eye. The woman's typically composed expression carried a tightness around her green eyes that spoke of professional concern mixed with personal anger. She'd seen something that troubled her deeply. "Sheriff Hart," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, "we appreciate you taking time for this. I know it might seem like family business, but—" "There's no need to explain," Caleb interrupted, gently. "When a child's involved, it's always my business. Please sit down." Clara remained pressed against her mother's side, her face turned away from the room. The vibrant, chattering girl who used to greet Caleb with enthusiastic waves whenever their paths crossed had vanished entirely. In her place stood a silent shadow, her small hands clutching a piece of torn fabric that might have once been part Of address. Dr. Mitchell spoke first. Sheriff, I've examined Clara at her parents' request. While I can't discuss specific medical details without Clara's permission, I can tell you that she's experienced something traumatic. Her reactions are consistent with severe psychological shock. Margaret Whitmore's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at her daughter. She won't tell us what happened. She just keeps saying, "Uncle Marcus was mean," and then she stops talking entirely. She's been having nightmares, waking up screaming about... Her voice broke. "About what, Mrs. Whitmore?" Caleb asked softly. "Dark places. Being hurt. She keeps asking if the bad men are coming back." Margaret wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. "Sheriff, my brother has been part of our family for Clara's entire life. He's never shown anything but kindness and love toward her. I can't understand what could have changed." Caleb studied Clara carefully. The child's entire posture spoke of fear and shame, emotions no 8-year-old should carry. In his early years as sheriff, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished childhood accidents from something more sinister. The way Clara flinched when anyone moved too quickly, how she kept checking the door as if expecting someone to burst through. These weren't the reactions of a girl who'd simply had a bad weekend. His own memories stirred, unbidden and unwelcome. Emma and Joshua had been about Clara's age when the fever took them 15 years ago now. The influenza outbreak of 1875 had claimed dozens of children in Cedar Ridge, including his own. His wife Sarah, named for the same saint as Dr. Mitchell, he'd often noted, had never recovered from the loss. She'd passed 2 years later, her heart simply unable to bear the weight of grief. Watching Clara now, seeing her small frame bent under an invisible burden, awakened every protective instinct Caleb had spent decades honing. No child should suffer. Like this, no parent should watch their baby retreat from the world. "Clara," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as summer rain. "Do you remember me? I'm Sheriff Hart. You used to wave at me when you came to town with your mama." The girl's eyes flicked toward him briefly before darting away. But he caught something in that momentary glance, recognition, and perhaps a tiny spark of the trust they'd built through those innocent encounters. "I know you've been through something scary," Caleb continued, "and I know grown-ups have been asking you lots of questions. But I want you to know something important. My job is to keep children safe. That's the most important thing I do, and right now, keeping you safe is what matters most to me." Clara's grip on the fabric tightened, but she raised her head slightly. "Doctor," Mitchell leaned forward. "Clara, you don't have to tell us everything right now, but if someone hurt you, Sheriff Hart needs to know so he can make sure it doesn't happen to you or any other children." The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of Cedar Ridge going about its daily business. Horses clopped past on the street below. The general store's bell chimed as customers came and went. Life continued its normal rhythm, while in this small office, a family's world had tilted off its axis. Finally, Clara whispered, "He said no one would believe me." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. Dr. Mitchell's expression hardened with professional determination, but Caleb felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd heard those exact words too many times. They were the calling card of men who used their position and reputation to silence their victims. "Clara," he said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside. "I believe you. Whatever happened, whatever anyone told you, I believe you. And I promise you this, no one is going to hurt you again, not while I'm wearing this badge." The child looked directly at him for the first time since entering his office. In her dark eyes, he saw pain that no child should know, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. "Will you help me stop the bad men?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Caleb Hart had sworn many oaths in his life. To uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to serve his community with honor and integrity. But as he looked at this broken little girl, he made the most solemn promise of his career. Yes, Clara, I will stop the bad men. That's a promise. Outside his window, Cedar Ridge continued its peaceful afternoon routine, unaware that everything was about to change, because Sheriff Caleb Hart had just committed himself to a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his community, his neighbors, and the very nature of evil itself. The weathered badge on his chest had never felt heavier or more important than it did in that moment. Every parent's worst nightmare is seeing their child return home broken and afraid. Sheriff Caleb Hart had buried 2 children of his own, so when 8-year-old Clara came back from her uncle's ranch with tears in her eyes and terror in her voice, his protective instincts kicked in hard. Clara had always been a bright, happy girl who loved visiting Uncle Marcus on his sprawling ranch outside Cedar Ridge. But something happened during that weekend visit that changed everything. The little girl who left home with a smile came back refusing to speak, flinching at shadows and clinging to anyone who would listen. Her Uncle Marcus was a respected rancher with deep community ties and a clean reputation. So what could have possibly happened at his ranch to leave a child so traumatized? What dark secret was hiding behind the friendly face that everyone in town trusted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Caleb Hart stood at his office window, watching the dust settle on Main Street as the morning sun climbed higher over Cedar Ridge. At 58, he'd worn this weathered badge for 3 decades, through boom times when the railroad brought prosperity and lean years when drought threatened to kill the town entirely. His fingers unconsciously traced the star-shaped metal pinned to his vest, a badge that had seen everything from cattle rustling to claim jumping, from saloon brawls to family disputes that stretched back generations. But nothing in those 30 years had prepared him for what he'd witnessed an hour ago when Clara Whitmore stumbled off the afternoon stage, her small frame trembling like a leaf in a winter wind. The girl's parents, Thomas and Margaret Whitmore, had been beside themselves with worry. They'd sent their daughter for what should have been a delightful weekend with Margaret's brother Marcus, who owned the most successful ranch in the territory. Marcus Whitmore was everything a man aspired to be in Cedar Ridge: prosperous, respected, generous with his church donations, and quick to help neighbors in need. His ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, and his cattle bore the finest bloodlines money could buy. Yet Clara had returned from that paradise, looking like she'd witnessed the end of the world. Caleb's deputy, Tom Bradley, knocked on the doorframe before entering. At 35, Tom had the eager energy of a man still proving himself, though he'd been working alongside Caleb for nearly 8 years. His sandy hair was perpetually mussed from riding, and his earnest brown eyes held a deep respect for his mentor that sometimes made Caleb feel older than his years. "Sheriff, the Whitmores are here with Clara," Tom said quietly. "Doc Mitchell's with them. Thought you'd want to know before they come up." Caleb nodded, straightening his shoulders. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was the closest thing Cedar Ridge had to a specialist in matters involving children. She'd arrived from back east 5 years ago, carrying credentials from fancy medical schools and a gentle manner that put even the most frightened child at ease. If anyone could help Clara find her voice, it would be Sarah. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs outside his office drew Caleb's attention. Thomas Whitmore appeared first, his weathered rancher's face etched with lines of worry that seemed to have deepened overnight. Behind him came Margaret, her usually pristine appearance disheveled, her dark hair escaping its careful arrangement. Between them walked Clara, so small she seemed to disappear in the shadow of the adults, but it was Dr. Mitchell who caught Caleb's eye. The woman's typically composed expression carried a tightness around her green eyes that spoke of professional concern mixed with personal anger. She'd seen something that troubled her deeply. "Sheriff Hart," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, "we appreciate you taking time for this. I know it might seem like family business, but there's no need to explain." Caleb interrupted, gently. When a child's involved, it's always my business. Please sit down. Clara remained pressed against her mother's side, her face turned away from the room. The vibrant, chattering girl, who used to greet Caleb with enthusiastic waves whenever their paths crossed, had vanished entirely. In her place stood a silent shadow, her small hands clutching a piece of torn fabric that might have once been part of a dress. Dr. Mitchell spoke first. Sheriff, I've examined Clara at her parents' request. While I can't discuss specific medical details without Clara's permission, I can tell you that she's experienced something traumatic. Her reactions are consistent with severe psychological shock. Margaret Whitmore's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at her daughter. She won't tell us what happened. She just keeps saying, Uncle Marcus was mean, and then she stops talking entirely. She's been having nightmares, waking up screaming about... Her voice broke. About what, Mrs. Whitmore? Caleb asked softly. Dark places. Being hurt. She keeps asking if the bad men are coming back. Margaret wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. Sheriff, my brother has been part of our family for Clara's entire life. He's never shown anything but kindness and love toward her. I can't understand what could have changed. Caleb studied Clara carefully. The child's entire posture spoke of fear and shame, emotions no 8-year-old should carry. In his early years as sheriff, he'd learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished childhood accidents from something more sinister. The way Clara flinched when anyone moved too quickly, how she kept checking the door, as if expecting someone to burst through. These weren't the reactions of a girl who'd simply had a bad weekend. His own memories stirred, unbidden and unwelcome. Emma and Joshua had been about Clara's age when the fever took them, 15 years ago now. The influenza outbreak of 1875 had claimed dozens of children in Cedar Ridge, including his own. His wife, Sarah, named for the same saint as Dr. Mitchell he'd often noted, had never recovered from the loss. She'd passed 2 years later, her heart simply unable to bear the weight of grief. Watching Clara now, seeing her small frame bent under an invisible burden, awakened every protective instinct Caleb had spent decades honing. No child should suffer like this. No parent should watch their baby retreat from the world. Clara, he said, keeping his voice as gentle as summer rain. Do you remember me? I'm Sheriff Hart. You used to wave at me when you came to town with your mama. The girl's eyes flicked toward him briefly before darting away. But he caught something in that momentary glance, recognition, and perhaps a tiny spark of the trust they'd built through those innocent encounters. I know you've been through something scary, Caleb continued, and I know grown-ups have been asking you lots of questions. But I want you to know something important. My job is to keep children safe. That's the most important thing I do. And right now, keeping you safe is what matters most to me. Clara's grip on the fabric tightened, but she raised her head slightly. Doctor. Mitchell leaned forward. Clara, you don't have to tell us everything right now, but if someone hurt you, Sheriff Hart needs to know so he can make sure it doesn't happen to you or any other children. The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of Cedar Ridge going about its daily business. Horses clopped past on the street below. The general store's bell chimed as customers came and went. Life continued its normal rhythm, while in this small office a family's world had tilted off its axis. Finally, Clara whispered, "He said no one would believe me." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Margaret gasped, covering her mouth. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. Dr. Mitchell's expression hardened with professional determination, but Caleb felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd heard those exact words too many times. They were the calling card of men who used their position and reputation to silence their victims. "Clara," he said, his voice steady, despite the anger building inside. I believe you. Whatever happened, whatever anyone told you, I believe you. And I promise you this, no one is going to hurt you again. Not while I'm wearing this badge." The child looked directly at him for the first time since entering his office. In her dark eyes, he saw pain that no child should know. But he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. "Will you help me stop the bad men?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. Caleb Hart had sworn many oaths in his life. To uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to serve his community with honor and integrity. But as he looked at this broken little girl, he made the most solemn promise of his career. "Yes, Clara, I will stop the bad men. That's a promise." Outside his window, Cedar Ridge continued its peaceful afternoon routine, unaware that everything was about to change. Because Sheriff Caleb Hart had just committed himself to a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his community, his neighbors, and the very nature of evil itself. The weathered badge on his chest had never felt heavier or more important than it did in that moment. 3 days later, Caleb found himself sitting across from Martha Henderson in the abandoned cabin where she and her family had taken refuge 20 miles outside of Cedar Ridge. The woman looked like she'd aged 10 years in the 6 months since. Her daughter's ordeal, her once bright eyes now haunted by shadows that never quite left. "I knew you'd come eventually," Martha said, pouring weak coffee from a dented pot. "Soon as I heard about the Whitmore girl, I knew someone would finally start asking the right questions." Her husband Jacob sat silently in the corner, whittling a piece of wood with mechanical precision. He hadn't looked up when Caleb arrived, hadn't acknowledged the sheriff's presence at all. Some men broke under pressure by fighting. Others simply retreated so far inside themselves that they might never find their way back out. "Tell me about Sarah," Caleb said gently. "Tell me what happened at Marcus's ranch." Martha's hands trembled as she set down her cup. "Our Sarah was always such a happy child, laughed all the time, loved to play with her dolls, helped me with the cooking. But after that weekend," she shook her head. "She stopped talking for 2 weeks, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, just sat in the corner of her room staring at nothing." "Did she tell you what happened?" "Eventually, little pieces at a time, like she was afraid the words themselves might hurt her. She drew pictures too, horrible pictures of men doing things to children that no man should ever—" Martha's voice broke. In the corner, Jacob's whittling became more aggressive, the knife carving deeper into the wood. "There was more than just Marcus," Martha continued. "Sarah described a man in black robes who watched everything. Another man who gave her candy before it started. And there were other children there, Sheriff, not just our Sarah." Caleb felt his stomach turn. "Other children?" 3 or 4, she said. "Some older, some younger, all of them scared, all of them trapped in that place." The sheriff pulled out a leather-bound ledger he'd discovered in Marcus's office during an unofficial search the night before. The book contained detailed financial records, but not for cattle sales or ranch operations. Instead, it documented payments to various men around Cedar Ridge, substantial sums with cryptic notations beside each name. "Martha, I'm going to show you some names. Tell me if any of them sound familiar." He opened the ledger to a page marked, with recent entries. Edmund Cross, $500, dated 2 weeks before Sarah's visit. Judge Harrison Blackwood, $300, same time frame. Dr. William Hayes, $200. Martha's face went white. "Dr. Hayes examined Sarah when we brought her home. He said she just had a bad fall, nothing to worry about. But he insisted on examining her alone, and afterward he told us we should consider moving away from Cedar Ridge. For Sarah's health, he said." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just a few men preying on children. It was an organized network with tentacles reaching into every institution that should have protected the innocent. The judge who should have dispensed justice, the doctor who should have healed the wounded, the businessman who should have served his community, all of them corrupted, all of them complicit. "There's something else," Martha whispered, glancing toward her husband. "The night before we left town, Judge Blackwood came to our house. He had an envelope full of money, more cash than Jacob makes in 3 years of farming. He said it was compensation for Sarah's unfortunate accident, and our discretion in not spreading rumors that might damage innocent reputations. You took the money? Jacob's knife slipped, drawing blood from his thumb. He looked up for the first time since Caleb's arrival, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shame and rage. What choice did we have? He said hoarsely. Blackwood made it. Clear what would happen to Sarah, to all of us, if we talked. And he was right. Who would believe us against men like that? We're nobody, Sheriff. Farmers with no education, no influence, no power. They could have destroyed us completely. Caleb understood the terrible logic. In a town where the judge, the prominent businessman, and the respected rancher all vouched for each other's character, what chance would a farming family have had of being believed? But taking the money, Martha's voice cracked with guilt. It felt like we were selling our daughter's pain, like we were letting those monsters win. You did what you had to do to protect your family, Caleb said firmly. That's not weakness, that's survival. But now I need you to help me make sure no other children suffer what Sarah suffered. Martha looked at her husband, and some silent communication passed between them. Jacob set down his whittling and nodded slowly. What do you need from us, Sheriff? Caleb pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. I need you to tell me everything Sarah said about that weekend. Every detail, no matter how small. I need you to describe exactly what Judge Blackwood said when he came to your house. And I need you to testify, when the time comes, about what happened to your daughter. Testify. In Blackwood's own courtroom, not if I can help it. I'm going to contact the Territorial Marshal's office. This case is too big for local jurisdiction, and there are too many corrupt officials involved. But I'll need witnesses, brave witnesses, who are willing to stand up and tell the truth. Martha reached across the table and gripped Caleb's hand. If it will stop these men from hurting other children, we'll do whatever you ask. As Caleb rode back towards Cedar Ridge, the weight of the ledger in his saddlebags felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. The financial records painted a picture of systematic corruption stretching back years. Regular payments to doctors, judges, and other officials. Coded references to special events and guest arrangements. Most chilling of all, a section labeled Operational Security, with payments to men known for their willingness to solve problems through violence and intimidation. The Henderson family had been lucky to escape with their lives. Others might not be so fortunate. That evening, Caleb sat in his office as the sun set over Cedar Ridge, studying every entry in Marcus's ledger. Each payment told a story of innocence betrayed and justice corrupted. But it also provided a roadmap for his investigation, a guide to exactly which pillars of the community had been hollowed out by rot. Deputy Tom knocked and entered without waiting for permission. Sheriff, we might have a problem. Word's getting around town about your visits to Marcus's ranch. Judge Blackwood's been asking questions about your activities. And Edmund Cross stopped by earlier, wanting to know if you needed any assistance with the Whitmore case. Caleb wasn't surprised. In a town the size of Cedar Ridge, secrets were hard to keep. The conspirators would be watching his every move, looking for ways to discredit his investigation before it could gain momentum. Let them ask questions, he said finally. The more nervous they get, the more likely they are to make mistakes. And when they do, we'll be ready. The anonymous letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Caleb's office door sometime during the pre-dawn hours, when even the most dedicated drunks had stumbled home, and the streets lay empty, except for stray dogs and the occasional coyote. CTU. Paper was expensive, the kind sold at Edmund Cross's general store, but the handwriting was deliberately disguised, clearly written with the non-dominant hand to avoid identification. Still, Caleb could tell it came from someone educated, someone familiar with proper grammar and spelling. Sheriff Hart, it read. You are closer to the truth than you know, but also in more danger than you realize. They are planning another. Gathering this weekend at the Whitmore Ranch. 3 children have already been selected. If you value innocent lives, you will act before Saturday night. A friend who cannot reveal themselves. Caleb read the letter 3 times before setting it down with hands that shook slightly. 3 children. The thought made his throat tight with remembered grief and present rage. Dr. Mitchell arrived an hour later with news that Clara's condition was slowly improving. The nightmares were less frequent, and she'd begun eating regular meals again. More importantly, she'd started talking about the weekend at her uncle's ranch in greater detail. She mentioned something troubling yesterday, Dr. Mitchell said, settling into the chair across from Caleb's desk. She said Uncle Marcus told her she was practice for something bigger that was coming soon. When I asked what she meant, she said there were going to be more children visiting the ranch, and Marcus wanted to make sure everything was ready for them. The anonymous letter suddenly felt like it was burning a hole in Caleb's pocket. Did she say when this might happen? Soon, she said, maybe this weekend or next. Sheriff, if there's any truth to what Clara's saying, there is. Caleb pulled out the letter and showed it to her. This arrived this morning. Dr. Mitchell's face paled as she read. Someone on the inside is trying to help, but who would have access to this kind of information and still be able to move freely around town? It was a question that had been nagging at Caleb all morning. The letter writer had to be someone close to the conspiracy, someone trusted enough to know about planned gatherings, but still possessed of enough conscience to risk exposure. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. I need to get Clara somewhere safe, he said finally. If they're planning something for this weekend, and if they think she's talked too much already, I've been thinking the same thing. My cabin is isolated, and I can watch over her medically while keeping her hidden. But, Sheriff, we need more than just one child's testimony to bring down men this powerful. We need evidence that will stand up in court. Caleb nodded grimly. Tom's working on that. He's volunteered to go undercover, see if he can get close enough to document what's happening at these gatherings. That's incredibly dangerous. If they discover he's a law officer, I know, but we're running out of options and time. Every day we hesitate is another day these monsters have to hurt children. That afternoon, Caleb made the difficult journey to the Whitmore Ranch to speak with Thomas and Margaret about moving Clara to safety. He found them in their kitchen, both looking like they'd aged a decade in the past week. Margaret's hands shook as she poured coffee. We've been getting visitors, Sheriff. People stopping by to check on Clara, asking how she's doing, whether
she's been talking to anyone about her weekend with Uncle Marcus.
What kind of people? Thomas answered. Judge Blackwood came by yesterday, said he'd heard Clara was having some adjustment difficulties and wondered if there was anything the community could do to help. Asked a lot of questions about her state of mind, whether she was confused about what happened at Marcus's place. And this morning, Margaret added, Edmund Cross stopped by the store just as I was buying supplies. He was very friendly, very concerned about Clara's well-being. But he kept asking whether she'd been having bad dreams, whether she might be mixing up reality with nightmares. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. They were building a defense already, preparing to paint Clara as a disturbed child whose testimony couldn't be trusted. It was a strategy that had probably worked for them before. I need you to bring Clara to Dr. Mitchell's cabin tonight, he said. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't come back until I give you the all clear. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. How did this happen, Sheriff? How did we not know that my own brother, that our friends and neighbors, evil hides behind respectability? Caleb said gently. It always has. These men count on our trust, our reluctance to believe the worst about people we've known for years. That's how they've gotten away with it for so long. That evening, as the Whitmore family quietly slipped out of town under cover of darkness, Caleb received an unexpected visitor. Marcus's wife, Eleanor, appeared at his office door like a ghost, her face pale and her eyes rimmed with red from crying. Sheriff Hart, she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I need to speak with you, but not here. Somewhere private." They met at the old abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a building that had been struck by lightning the previous spring and never rebuilt. Eleanor moved like a woman carrying the weight of terrible secrets, her shoulders hunched against both the evening chill and the burden of what she'd come to reveal. "I wrote you that letter," she said without preamble. "I've been trying to find the courage to speak up for months, but I was too frightened, too ashamed." Caleb waited, letting her find her own pace. "I've known about Marcus for 2 years now. Caught him with a child from town. A little boy whose parents thought he was just being kind, offering to teach the boy about horses and ranch work." Eleanor's voice broke. "When I confronted Marcus, he laughed. Said I could leave if I didn't like it, but I'd leave with nothing. He has connections, Sheriff. Powerful connections who would make sure I was painted as an unstable woman whose word couldn't be trusted. But you stayed. I stayed because I was a coward. Because I was comfortable and secure, and I told myself that maybe it would stop. Maybe it was just a momentary lapse in judgment." Tears streamed down her face, but it didn't stop. It got worse. More children, more often. And other men started. Coming to the ranch, men I'd respected my whole life. "The gathering this weekend, tell me about it." Eleanor wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Saturday night. 3 children have been selected. The Morrison boy, young Katie from the schoolteacher's family, and a child from one of the traveling families camped outside town. Their parents don't know, of course. They think their children are being honored with invitations to a special ranch celebration." "How do you know all this?" "Marcus doesn't see me anymore. I'm just the wife who keeps house and stays quiet. He talks around me like I'm a piece of furniture. Plans his horrors in my kitchen while I serve coffee to Judge Blackwood and Edmund, Cross and the others." Caleb felt pieces clicking into place. "How many others, Eleanor?" "At least 6 men regularly, sometimes more. They call themselves the Cedar Ridge Men's Club, can you believe it? Like they're just a group of fellows getting together to play cards and discuss business." The scope of the conspiracy was even larger than Caleb had imagined. This wasn't just a few predators. It was an organized network that had been operating under the cover of respectability for years. "Eleanor, I need you to help us stop this. Will you testify about what you've seen and heard?" She was quiet for so long that Caleb wondered if she'd changed her mind. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, God help." "Yes, I can't live with this silence anymore. Those children deserve better than my cowardice." Deputy Tom Bradley had never been so terrified in his life, not even during his first gunfight with cattle rustlers 3 years earlier. But here he was, dressed in borrowed clothes and carrying forged credentials, identifying him as a traveling photographer interested in documenting ranch life, walking directly into the heart of the most dangerous conspiracy Cedar Ridge had ever known. The plan was simple in theory. Get invited to Marcus Whitmore's ranch, document whatever evidence he could find and get out alive. In practice, Tom knew he was walking into a nest of vipers who wouldn't hesitate to kill him if they discovered his true identity. Eleanor Whitmore had made the introduction, telling Marcus that she'd met a charming young photographer in town who was fascinated by successful ranch operations. Marcus, ever eager to show off his prosperity, had invited Tom to spend the weekend documenting the business operations at the ranch. What Tom discovered in Marcus's hidden root cellar would haunt him for the rest of his days. The cellar had been converted into a series of small rooms, connected by narrow hallways. The main chamber contained furniture that had clearly been designed for restraint rather than comfort. Tables with leather straps, chairs with iron rings attached to their arms and legs. But it was the walls that provided the most damning evidence. Photographs, dozens of them, carefully arranged and catalogued like trophies in a hunter's den. They showed children in various states of distress and abuse, with adult figures whose faces were clearly visible, participating in acts that would send them to the gallows if a jury ever saw them. Tom recognized Judge Blackwood immediately in Several photographs, his distinctive beard and judicial bearing unmistakable even in the dim light. Edmund Cross appeared in others, his merchant's apron replaced by expensive clothes that spoke of wealth built on unspeakable crimes. Dr. Hayes was there too, his medical training apparently perverted to ensure victims remained conscious and compliant during their ordeals. But the photograph that stopped Tom cold showed a group of men standing around what appeared to be some sort of ceremony. In the center, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a small figure Tom recognized as Clara Whitmore. The image had been taken during her weekend visit, providing undeniable proof of what had been done to her. With hands that shook from rage and revulsion, Tom carefully removed several of the most damning photographs, tucking them inside his jacket. Each image represented not just evidence of crimes already committed, but also a child whose innocence had been stolen by men who should have protected them. As he prepared to leave the cellar, Tom heard voices approaching from above. Marcus was returning with someone, multiple someones, based on the heavy footsteps crossing the floor of the ranch house. Tom quickly extinguished his lantern and pressed himself into the shadows of the farthest corner, praying that whoever was coming wouldn't need anything from the cellar. "Everything ready for Saturday night," Marcus was saying as the group descended the stairs. "Eleanor's been asking too many questions lately, but she won't be a problem much longer. You're certain she can be trusted to keep quiet?" This voice Tom didn't recognize, but it carried the authority of education and wealth. "Eleanor knows what's good for her," Marcus replied coldly. "And if she doesn't, well, accidents happen on ranches all the time." Tom felt his blood run cold. They were planning to kill Eleanor Whitmore, the one witness brave enough to come forward. "What about the sheriff?" Judge Blackwood's distinctive voice joined the conversation. "Hart's been asking too many questions, visiting too many people. He's becoming a liability." "Hart's an old man with no allies," Edmund Cross said dismissively. "Who's going to believe him against all of us? We control the law in this town. We control the money. We control the information. One broken-down sheriff can't touch us." "Don't underestimate him," the unknown voice warned. "Hart has 30 years of experience and a reputation for stubbornness. If he gets his hands on real evidence, then we make sure he doesn't," Marcus said with finality, "or we make sure no one believes anything he says. Dead men tell no tales, after all." The group moved deeper into the cellar complex, discussing plans that made Tom's stomach turn. They spoke of the weekend's entertainment as casually as ranchers might discuss cattle prices, reducing children to commodities to be used and discarded. When they finally left, Tom waited another hour before emerging from his hiding place. The photographs in his jacket felt like they were burning through the fabric, evidence so damning that it could bring down the entire conspiracy if he could get it to Sheriff Hart alive. The journey back to town felt like the longest ride of Tom's life. Every shadow might hide an assassin. Every sound might signal that his cover had been blown, but when he finally reached the sheriff's office and spread the photographs across Caleb's desk, he knew the risk had been worthwhile. Caleb studied each image with the methodical attention to detail that had made him a legendary lawman. His face grew harder with each photograph, and by the time he reached the image showing Clara, his hands were clenched into fists. "This is it," he said finally. "This is everything we need to bring them all down." Judge, jury, and the territorial governor himself couldn't ignore evidence like this. "There's more," Tom said, and related the conversation he'd overheard about Eleanor and the threats against Caleb himself. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Then he reached for his hat and gun belt. "We need to get Eleanor to safety immediately, and we need to send word to the territorial marshal. This has gone beyond local jurisdiction." As they prepared to leave, Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the window, he could see several men gathering across the street from the sheriff's office. They weren't making any effort to hide their presence. In fact, they seemed to want to be seen. Judge Blackwood stood in the center of the group. his judicial robes replaced by the practical clothes of a man preparing for violence. Edmund Cross was there too, along with 3 other men Tom didn't recognize, but who had the look of hired guns rather than local citizens. "Sheriff," Tom said, quietly. "I think they know." Caleb looked out the window and nodded grimly. "They know we have evidence, and they know we're about to use it. The question is whether they're here to intimidate us or kill us." The answer came quickly. Judge Blackwood separated from the group and walked deliberately toward the sheriff's office, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol that looked entirely too comfortable in his grip. "Sheriff Hart," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your recent activities. Why don't you step outside where we can discuss this like civilized men?" Caleb checked his weapons and looked at Tom. "Deputy, I want you to take those photographs and ride hard for the territorial capital. Don't stop for anything or anyone, and don't trust anyone you meet along the way. Get those images to Marshal Stone and tell her what's happening here. I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "You're not leaving me," Caleb said firmly. "You're saving the lives of every child these monsters plan to hurt. That evidence is more important than either of our lives." Tom understood the logic, but it went against every instinct he had as both a lawman and a friend. Still, he gathered up the photographs and prepared to slip out the back door. "Sheriff," he said, as he prepared to leave, "what about Eleanor? If they suspect she's the one who helped us, I'll get to her first," Caleb promised. "One way or another, this ends tonight." Clara's breakthrough came at 3 in the morning, in the safety of Dr. Mitchell's remote cabin, with moonlight filtering through pine trees and casting gentle shadows on the walls. She'd been staying there for 2 days now, slowly regaining some of her natural childhood resilience when the nightmares finally gave way to something more precious, complete honesty. "Sheriff Hart," she said, her small voice cutting through the pre-dawn darkness, "I need to tell you about the machine." Caleb, who'd been dozing in a chair beside her bed, immediately came alert. Dr. Mitchell stirred from her position by the fireplace, where she'd been maintaining a careful vigil over her young patient. "What machine, Clara?" Uncle Marcus had a machine in the cellar. It made clicking sounds, like the telegraph at the railroad station. He used it to take pictures of what the bad men did to us children. The implications hit Caleb like a physical blow. They hadn't just been abusing children, they'd been documenting it, creating permanent records of their crimes. The photographs Tom had discovered were just the tip of a much larger collection. "Clara, did you see where Uncle Marcus kept these pictures?" "In a big book, like the ledgers Papa uses for ranch business." He showed them to the other men, especially the one in black robes. They would look at the pictures and talk about which children were their favorites. Dr. Mitchell moved closer, her medical training helping her ask the questions that needed answers without further traumatizing the child. "Were there pictures of other children you recognized? Children from town?" Clara nodded solemnly. "Billy Thompson was in lots of pictures, and Sarah Henderson, and some children I didn't know, maybe from other towns." The scope of the conspiracy was even more staggering than Caleb had imagined. This wasn't just a local network of predators. They were apparently bringing in victims from multiple communities, operating across territorial boundaries. As Clara continued her revelations, Caleb found himself thinking about his own children, with a mixture of grief and terrible understanding. Emma and Joshua had died of influenza, that much was true. But now he wondered if their deaths had been as natural as everyone believed. "Clara," he said gently, "did any of the men ever talk about other children who weren't there anymore? Children who might have gotten sick or had accidents?" The little girl's eyes grew wide, and she nodded slowly. "Uncle Marcus said some children were too fragile for their games. He said they had to be more careful now, after some children broke and couldn't play anymore." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. The euphemistic language was chilling in its implications. These men had been killing children for years, disguising murders as accidents or illnesses. A soft scratching at the cabin door interrupted his dark thoughts. Dr. Mitchell moved to the window and peered out carefully before opening it to admit Eleanor Whitmore, who slipped inside like a frightened animal seeking shelter. "Sheriff," Eleanor whispered urgently, "they know about our meeting. Marcus found the letter I wrote. I'd hidden it in my sewing basket, but he was looking for something and discovered it. He knows I've been talking to you." "Where is he now?" "Gathering. The others, Judge Blackwood, Edmund Cross, Dr. Hayes, all of them are meeting at the ranch tonight. They're planning something terrible, Sheriff. Not just for me, but for you and anyone else who threatens their secret." Caleb felt the familiar weight of a decision that would change everything. He could wait for help from the territorial marshal, try to build a case through proper legal channels. Or he could act tonight, knowing that delay might cost more innocent lives. The decision was made for him when Eleanor produced a small recording device from her coat, a mechanical marvel that had arrived from back east just months earlier. "I managed to record part of their planning session," she said, her hands shaking as she operated the unfamiliar machinery. "Listen to this." The recording quality was poor, but the voices were recognizable. Marcus's baritone mixed with Judge Blackwood's authoritative tones and Edmund Cross's nasal whine. But it was the content of their conversation that made Caleb's blood run cold. "Hart knows too much to be allowed to live," Blackwood was saying, "and his deputy has been asking questions all over town. They're both liabilities that need to be eliminated. What about the children who've already talked?" This was Dr. Hayes. "The Whitmore girl, the Henderson family, if they return—" "Accidents happen," Marcus replied casually. "Children are fragile creatures. Sometimes they don't recover from traumatic experiences." "And the wife? Eleanor's been a problem for months. It's time she had a riding accident. Horses can be so unpredictable." The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing plans that amounted to wholesale murder to protect the conspiracy. By the time it ended, Caleb had heard enough to know that waiting for official help was no longer an option. "Eleanor," he said, "how many men will be at the ranch tonight?" "At least 8, maybe more. They're calling it an emergency meeting of the Cedar Ridge Men's Club. They plan to eliminate all the threats to their organization in one coordinated effort." Caleb considered his options. 8 armed men, all with significant resources and no moral constraints, against one aging sheriff and whatever allies he could muster. The odds were not encouraging, but as he looked at Clara, sitting quietly in her nightgown and listening to adults discuss the casual murder of children, he knew that odds didn't matter. Some things were worth dying for, and protecting the innocent was at the top of that list. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, "I need you to take Clara and Eleanor somewhere safe. Somewhere far from Cedar Ridge where they can't be found. What about you? I'm going to end this tonight. One way or another, these men will never hurt another child." Clara moved from her bed and took Caleb's weathered hand in her small one. "Sheriff Hart, will you promise me something?" "What's that, sweetheart?" "Promise me that when you stop the bad men, you'll make sure they can never hurt any other children like me." Caleb looked into her dark eyes, eyes that had seen too much but still held hope for justice, and made the most solemn vow of his life. "I promise, Clara. No matter what it costs me, I promise." As he prepared to leave the cabin for what might be his final confrontation, Caleb found himself thinking not just about Clara and the other victims, but about Emma and Joshua. For 15 years, he'd believed their deaths were a cruel twist of fate. Now he suspected they might have been something far more sinister. If his children had been murdered to protect this conspiracy, then tonight would be about more than just justice for the living. Tonight would be about vengeance for the dead. The recording device Eleanor had used was still sitting on the table, its mechanical heart containing evidence that could destroy the conspiracy forever. But only if someone survived to present it to the proper authorities. As Caleb stepped into the night, heading toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of Cedar Ridge's children for generations to come, he carried with him not just weapons and evidence, but the weight of every father's duty to protect the innocent, even if it meant sacrificing himself in the process. The discovery came by accident, as so many life-changing revelations do. While searching through storage boxes in his own home for additional ammunition before the confrontation at Marcus's ranch, Caleb's hand brushed against a familiar leather-bound book he hadn't seen in 15 years, his son Joshua's diary. He'd packed it away after the boy's death, unable to bear reading the thoughts and dreams of a child who would never grow up to fulfill them. But something made him pause now. Perhaps some instinct honed by 3 decades of law enforcement, and opened the diary to its final entries. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about his children's deaths. March 15th, 1875. Joshua had written in his careful 12-year-old script, "The man at the store gave me candy again today. Mr. Cross says I'm special, that he wants to teach me about business, but something about the way he looks at me makes my stomach feel funny. Mama says I should be polite to adults, but I don't think I want to go to his store anymore." Caleb's hands began to tremble as he continued reading. March 22nd, 1875. Mr. Cross asked me to come to a special party at Mr. Whitmore's ranch. He said there would be other boys there, and we could learn about ranching. But when I asked if Emma could come too, he got angry and said girls weren't allowed. Papa always says that when adults don't want girls around, it usually means they're up to something bad. The entries continued, each one building a picture that made Caleb sick to his stomach. Edmund Cross had been grooming Joshua, just as he'd later groom Billy Thompson and countless other children. But Joshua had been suspicious, had asked too many questions, had threatened to tell his parents about the strange behavior of Cedar Ridge's most respected businessman. April 2nd, 1875. I told Emma about Mr. Cross and the weird things he says to me. She says we should tell Papa, but I'm scared they won't believe us. Mr. Cross is important, and we're just children. But Emma's brave. She says if we stick together, we can protect each other. Caleb's eyes blurred with tears as the truth became clear. His children hadn't died of influenza. They'd been murdered because they'd threatened to expose the conspiracy 15 years before it was ready to be exposed. The final entry was dated just 2 days before Emma and Joshua fell ill. April 10th, 1875. Emma and I decided to tell Papa everything tomorrow. We wrote down all the strange things Mr. Cross said, all the times Judge Blackwood asked us odd questions when Mama wasn't around, all the times Dr. Hayes wanted to examine us when we weren't even sick. Emma says we have to be brave for all the other children in town. She says someone has to stop the bad men, even if everyone thinks they're good men. But they never got the chance to tell their father. Within hours of writing that entry, both children had fallen violently ill with symptoms that Dr. Hayes had diagnosed as influenza. They died within days, taking their secrets with them to graves that Caleb now realized were not the result of natural causes, but of calculated murder. The man who'd pretended to treat his dying children had actually been poisoning them. Caleb closed the diary and sat in the darkness of his home, feeling 15 years of grief transform into something harder and more dangerous. The conspiracy hadn't just been abusing children, it had been killing any child who threatened to expose them. His own son and daughter had been murdered for trying to do what was right. A soft knock at his door interrupted his dark thoughts. When he opened it, he found Tom Bradley standing there, dusty from hard riding, and carrying a telegram from the territorial capital. "Sheriff," Tom said urgently, "I've got bad news. Marshal Stone can't get here for at least a week. There's been an Indian uprising 2 territories over, and all available marshals have been deployed to deal with it. Under normal circumstances, this would have been devastating news." But as Caleb looked at his son's diary, still open to those final prophetic entries, he felt something like relief. This wasn't a job for official law enforcement anymore. This was personal. "Tom, I need to show you something." He handed the diary to his deputy and watched the younger man's face change as he read. Tom had known Emma and Joshua Hart, had played with them, laughed with them, mourned their deaths alongside the entire community. To discover that their deaths had been orchestrated by the very men trusted to protect them hit Tom like a physical blow. My God, Tom whispered. They killed your children. They killed my children because Emma and Joshua were trying to protect other children, just like Clara is trying to do now. Caleb took back the diary and tucked it inside his jacket. Next, to his heart. Which means tonight isn't just about stopping these monsters from hurting more innocents. It's about finishing what my children started 15 years ago. What are we going to do? Caleb looked at his deputy, really looked at him, taking in the young man's courage, his dedication, his willingness to risk everything for justice. Tom reminded him of Joshua in many ways, and he felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. We're going to end this conspiracy once and for all. But first, I need you to do something for me. He pulled out the photographs Tom had recovered from Marcus's ranch, along with Eleanor's recording device and his son's diary. I want you to take all of this evidence and ride to the county seat. Find Judge Morrison. He's one of the few honest judges left in the territory. Give him everything and tell him what's happened here. But Sheriff, no arguments, Tom. If something happens to me tonight, someone needs to be alive to see that justice is done. Someone needs to make sure the story gets told. Tom reluctantly accepted the evidence, understanding the logic even as he hated abandoning his mentor. What about the children they're planning to take this weekend? I'll make sure there is no weekend gathering. I promise you that. As Tom prepared to leave, Caleb pulled out one more item. His father's old service revolver, a weapon he'd carried through the Civil War and passed down to his son when Caleb became sheriff. If I don't make it through tonight, he said, I want you to have this. It's been carried by honest lawmen for 40 years. Don't let that tradition die with me. Tom took the weapon with the solemnity of a man accepting a sacred trust. You'll make it through, Sheriff. You have to. Clara and all those other children need you. After Tom left, Caleb sat alone in his house for the last time, surrounded by memories of the family he'd lost and the life he'd built in their absence. On the mantelpiece sat a photograph of Emma and Joshua, taken just months before their deaths. They looked so young, so innocent, so full of life and promise, but in their eyes he could now see something he'd missed before, a maturity beyond their years, a determination that spoke of children who'd seen darkness and chosen to fight it. Rather than flee from it, they'd been heroes, his children. They died trying to protect other children from monsters, just as he was about to do. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 15 years, he'd grieved for children he thought had been taken by disease. Now he knew they'd been taken by evil. But he also knew they'd faced that evil with courage that would have made any father proud. As he loaded his weapons and prepared for the confrontation that would determine the future of Cedar Ridge, Caleb felt his children's presence with him, not as ghosts seeking vengeance, but as guardians watching over their father as he finished the work they'd been too young to complete. Tonight, the Cedar Ridge Men's Club would learn what happened when they threatened the innocent in Sheriff Caleb Hart's territory. Tonight, they would discover that some men don't stop fighting just because the odds are impossible. And tonight, 15 years late, but not too late to matter, a father would finally avenge his murdered children. The telegram from the territorial capital arrived just as Caleb was making his final preparations. Marshal Rebecca Stone's response was brief, but carried the weight of official authority. Emergency warrants approved. Stop federal jurisdiction. Established. Stop arriving with backup officers. Dawn Saturday. Stop maintain evidence. Integrity. Stop do not engage without support. Stop. But Saturday. Dawn was still 18 hours away, and Caleb knew that the Cedar Ridge Men's Club wouldn't wait for federal intervention. Eleanor's intelligence suggested they were planning to eliminate all threats tonight, which meant Clara, Dr. Mitchell, and anyone else who'd spoken against them were in immediate danger. As he pinned the federal warrant to his vest alongside his sheriff's badge, Caleb felt the weight of legitimate authority backing his actions for the first time since this nightmare began. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he would be acting not just as a grieving father or a small-town lawman, but as a duly appointed agent of territorial justice. The knock on his door came at exactly 9 o'clock, soft but insistent. When he opened it, he found an unexpected ally, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, carrying a medical bag in one hand and a rifle in the other. "Before you object," she said, stepping inside without invitation, "let me remind you that I've seen what these monsters do to children. I've documented their handiwork, treated their victims, and watched families flee in terror rather than seek justice. If you think I'm going to sit quietly in a cabin while you face them alone, you don't know me very well." Caleb studied the determined set of her jaw, the steady grip she maintained on her weapon. Dr. Mitchell had grown up on the frontier before pursuing her medical education back east. She knew how to handle both a scalpel and a rifle with equal skill. Clara and Eleanor are safely hidden with Reverend Morrison's family 30 miles north of here. The Reverend's son rode out this afternoon with my instructions. They're armed, warned, and ready to protect my patients if necessary. The practical part of Caleb's mind recognized the wisdom of having a doctor present for what was likely to be a violent confrontation. The protective part of him recoiled at the idea of putting another person in danger, especially a woman he'd come to respect and care for. "Sarah, these men have killed children. They won't hesitate to kill adults who threaten them. Then we'll have to make sure we get them first." She moved to the window and peered out at the darkened street. "How many men are we facing?" "At least 8, possibly more. All armed, all desperate, and all with nothing left to lose." Dr. Mitchell nodded grimly. "What's the plan?" Caleb spread a rough map of the Whitmore Ranch across his kitchen table, marking buildings and approaches based on his knowledge of the property. "They're meeting in the main house, probably in Marcus's study, where they've held their club meetings before. The cellar entrance is here, the barn is positioned to block the view from the road, and there are at least 3 escape routes if they scatter. You're planning to take them all at once?" "I'm planning to make sure none of them escape. To hurt more children. Whether they surrender peacefully or choose to fight is up to them." Dr. Mitchell studied the map with the analytical mind that had made her an excellent physician. "The barn could provide cover for an approach, but it also gives them a defensive position if they retreat there. What about cutting off their escape routes first? That would require more people than we have. Tom's riding for the county seat with evidence. Marshal Stone won't arrive until morning, and I won't ask any other townspeople to risk their lives against men this dangerous." "What about the Whitmore Ranch hands? Surely some of Marcus's employees know what's been happening." Caleb had considered that possibility, but Eleanor's intelligence suggested that Marcus employed only men who were either complicit in the conspiracy or too intimidated to speak against it. "We have to assume anyone at the ranch tonight is either a predator or someone paid to keep quiet about predators." A distant sound caught their attention, the rumble of multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Through the window, they could see torches moving along the road that led from town toward the Whitmore Ranch. The Cedar Ridge Men's Club was gathering for their emergency meeting. "How many?" Dr. Mitchell asked quietly. Caleb counted the lights. "At least a dozen riders, more than Eleanor estimated." The implications were troubling. Either the conspiracy was larger than they'd realized, or Marcus had called in hired guns from outside Cedar Ridge to deal with the threat to their organization. "We could wait for Marshal Stone," Dr. Mitchell began. "No," Caleb's voice carried the finality of a man who'd already made his decision. "Every hour we delay gives them more time to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, or flee the territory entirely. And I won't spend another night knowing these monsters are free to plan their next gathering." He pulled out his son's diary and read aloud Joshua's final entry, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. When he finished, Dr. Mitchell's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your children were heroes, Caleb. They were trying to do what we're about to do. They were braver than I was. It took me 15 years and another child suffering to see what they understood immediately. He closed the diary carefully and tucked it back inside his jacket. I won't fail them again. Dr. Mitchell checked her rifle and made sure her medical bag was securely fastened. If we're going to do this, we should move now while they're all gathered in one place. But before they could leave, another sound reached them, the rapid approach of a single horse ridden hard. Tom Bradley materialized out of the darkness, his mount lathered and blowing from the urgent journey. "Sheriff," he called out before dismounting. "Judge Morrison wasn't at the county seat. His clerk said he'd been called away on urgent business. Business that took him towards Cedar Ridge." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Judge Morrison, one of the few honest jurists in the territory, had either been lured into a trap or was already dead. The conspiracy's reach extended even further than they'd imagined. "Tom, I told you to stay at the county seat. With respect, Sheriff, I'm not abandoning you to face this alone. The evidence is secure. I left it with the territorial attorney's office with instructions to forward everything to Marshal Stone. But my place is here, with you." Caleb looked at his young deputy, seeing in Tom's determined expression an echo of his own children's courage. Some fights required good men to stand together, regardless of the odds. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this carefully, and we do it smart. These men have spent years covering their tracks and eliminating threats. They won't go quietly." Dr. Mitchell moved to the window one more time, watching the distant torches disappear behind the hills that surrounded the Whitmore ranch. "They're all there now. Whatever they're planning, it's happening tonight." Caleb checked his weapons. One final time, his service revolver, his father's old Civil War pistol, and a rifle that had served him faithfully through countless confrontations. Each weapon carried the weight of history and the promise of justice. "Sarah, I want you to stay back during the initial confrontation. If Tom and I go down, someone needs to survive to testify about what happened here. And I want you to remember that I'm a doctor, not a helpless observer. I've seen what these men do to children, and I won't let them continue their horrors just to preserve my own safety." Tom adjusted his badge and checked his ammunition. "Sheriff, whatever happens tonight, I want you to know it's been an honor serving with you." Caleb felt a surge of pride and affection for the young man who'd chosen duty over safety, justice over comfort. "The honor's been mine, Deputy. Now let's go finish what my children started." As they prepared to ride toward the Whitmore Ranch and the confrontation that would determine the fate of Cedar Ridge's children, Caleb felt the presence of Emma and Joshua more strongly than ever. They died trying to protect the innocent, and their father was finally in a position to complete their mission. The Cedar Ridge Men's Club had spent 15 years believing they were untouchable, protected by their positions and their conspiracy of silence. Tonight, they would learn the price of underestimating a father's love and a lawman's duty. Tonight, justice would finally come to Cedar Ridge. The Whitmore Ranch lay spread before them like a scene from a nightmare, its windows blazing with lamplight and shadows moving within that spoke of urgent, secretive activity. Caleb, Tom, and Dr. Mitchell had positioned themselves in the tree line overlooking the property, close enough to observe, but far enough away to avoid immediate detection. "Count 12 horses at the hitching post," Tom whispered, studying the scene through field glasses. "Plus, Marcus makes 13 men inside. More than we expected," Dr. Mitchell observed quietly, "but they're all in one place." Caleb studied the layout one more time, noting details that would be crucial in the coming confrontation. The main house dominated the center of the property, with the converted root cellar entrance visible from their position. The barn stood, dark and empty. Apparently all the conspiracy's business was being conducted in the house itself. "Tom, I want you to circle around to the back entrance. Give me 10 minutes to get into position at the front, then we move simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell, you stay here with the horses and keep watch for anyone trying to escape." "Caleb, no arguments, Sarah. If this goes wrong, someone needs to be alive to tell Marshal Stone what happened. As they prepared to separate, the sound of voices carried across the night air from the house. Even at this distance, they could make out the heated tones of men engaged in urgent discussion. Sheriff knows too much to be allowed to live. Eliminate. All witnesses before dawn. Children in the cellar must be disposed of. The last phrase hit Caleb like a physical blow. There were children in the cellar right now, victims who were about to be murdered to protect the conspiracy's secrets. Change of plans, he said grimly. We go now, before they have time to hurt anyone else. Tom nodded and began moving toward his assigned position, but Dr. Mitchell grabbed Caleb's arm. There are children in there right now. It sounds like it, which means we can't wait for perfect positioning or ideal circumstances. Every minute we delay could cost innocent lives. Dr. Mitchell checked her rifle one more time. Then we saved them, all of them. Caleb approached the main house with the calculated stealth of a man who'd spent 30 years walking into dangerous situations. The voices from inside grew clearer as he reached the wraparound porch, and what he heard confirmed his worst fears about the immediate danger facing any child victims. Judge Blackwood's authoritative voice dominated the conversation. The Henderson family has been located. They're hiding with relatives in the next territory, but they can be reached permanently. What about the Hart investigation? This was Edmund Cross, his merchant's voice tight with worry. If he's gathered evidence, then we eliminate the evidence along with the investigator, Marcus replied coldly. Hart's been a thorn in our side long enough. After tonight, he won't be a problem for anyone. And the children currently in our custody? They know too much to be released. Dr. Hayes can make their deaths look natural, another outbreak of something contagious. The community will mourn the tragic loss and never suspect the truth. Caleb felt rage surge through him, but he forced himself to remain focused. These men were planning mass murder to cover their crimes, and only immediate action could prevent it. He could see Tom moving into position at the rear of the house, visible for just a moment before disappearing into the shadows near the back. A door. The young deputy moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that lives depended on his actions. The moment had arrived. Caleb stepped onto the porch and walked directly to the front door. No subtlety, no hesitation. Sometimes the direct approach was the only one that worked. Marcus Whitmore, he called out, his voice carrying the full authority of 3 decades as a lawman. This is Sheriff Hart, by the authority of the territorial government. You're under arrest for crimes against children. Come out with your hands visible. The voices inside the house went silent, followed by the sounds of rapid movement and weapons being readied. You're outnumbered, Hart, Judge Blackwood's voice carried through the door. 13-1. Surrender now, and we might let you live long enough to see a trial. 13-3, Caleb corrected. And I've got federal warrants for all of you. Deputy Bradley is covering the back exit, and we've got backup coming. Your choices are surrender or die fighting. The response came in the form of gunfire, multiple weapons opening up simultaneously, bullets splintering the porch rail and doorframe around Caleb's position. He dove for cover behind a heavy wooden post, drawing his service revolver as return fire began from Tom's position at the rear of the house. Inside the house, men were shouting orders and accusations, their carefully planned meeting dissolved into chaos by the arrival of justice they thought they'd successfully avoided. The cellar! Marcus's voice rose above the gunfire. Get to the cellar and eliminate the witnesses. That was exactly what Caleb had been waiting to hear. Now he knew where the children were being held, and he knew the conspirators would lead him directly to them in their desperation to silence potential witnesses. The battle for Cedar Ridge's children had begun. The gunfight lasted barely 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to Caleb as he moved through the Whitmore house room by room, confronting men he'd known and trusted for decades. The reality of their corruption hit him like physical blows, as each respected community leader revealed himself to be a monster willing to kill to protect his secrets. Edmund Cross made his stand in the kitchen, using an overturned table for cover, while firing wildly with a pistol better suited for intimidating debtors than actual combat. When Caleb's return fire found its mark, the merchant's final words were a curse against the children who dared to speak the truth about him. Dr. Hayes barricaded himself in the study, shouting medical justifications for his participation in the conspiracy even as he reloaded his rifle. "They were already damaged goods," he screamed. "I was providing a service, keeping the unfit from reproducing." The man who'd pretended to heal Caleb's dying children while actually poisoning them fell without another word, brought down by a single shot from the sheriff's father's Civil War revolver. But it was Judge Blackwood who provided the final confirmation of everything Caleb had suspected about his children's deaths. The judge had retreated to the cellar entrance, using his judicial gavel as a makeshift club, while trying to reach the children imprisoned below. When Caleb cornered him there, Blackwood's mask of respectability finally slipped completely. "Your brats were too smart for their own good," he snarled, his black robes torn and stained with blood from a grazing wound. "Always asking questions, always threatening to tell their parents about our special games. We couldn't let them grow up to be problems, so you had Dr. Hayes poison them. Poison, accidents, sudden illnesses. Hayes was very creative in his methods. Your children weren't the first, Hart, and they wouldn't have been the last if you hadn't started interfering." Caleb felt 15 years of grief transform into something harder and more focused. The gavel in Blackwood's hand, the symbol of corrupted justice that had protected child predators for decades, would never again be used to pervert the law. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," Caleb said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the territorial government, you're under arrest for the murder of Emma and Joshua Hart, the abuse of Clara Whitmore, and conspiracy to commit crimes against children." Blackwood's response was a desperate lunge with the gavel, but 30 years of law enforcement had taught Caleb to read such attacks. The judge's final act was as ineffective as his corrupt rulings had been harmful. With the main house secured, Caleb and Tom moved to the cellar where they found the evidence that would haunt their dreams for years to come. 3 children were imprisoned in the converted chambers: the Morrison boy, Katie from the schoolteacher's family, and a young girl from the traveling family camped outside town. All 3 were alive but traumatized, their eyes holding the same haunted look Caleb had seen in Clara's face. But there was something else in their expressions too. Hope, sparked by the arrival of lawmen who'd actually come to help instead of hurt. "It's all right," Tom said gently, holstering his weapon and approaching the children with his hands visible. "We're here to take you home. You're safe now." Dr. Mitchell appeared at the cellar entrance, having abandoned her position to provide medical care for the rescued children. Her examination was swift but thorough, documenting injuries that would serve as evidence while providing immediate treatment for trauma, both physical and emotional. "They'll recover," she told Caleb quietly. "Physically, at least. The emotional healing will take longer, but children are resilient. With proper care and support, they can overcome this." As dawn broke over the Whitmore Ranch, the scope of the conspiracy's destruction became fully clear. Along with the photographs and recordings already secured as evidence, they found detailed financial records documenting bribes paid to officials across multiple territories. The Cedar Ridge Men's Club had been operating for over 20 years, claiming dozens of child victims and corrupting institutions throughout the region. But they also found something else: letters from other law enforcement officials who tried to investigate similar networks in neighboring towns, only to be transferred, discredited, or mysteriously killed in accidents. Caleb Hart hadn't been the first lawman to stumble onto this conspiracy, but by the grace of God and his children's guidance, he might be the last one needed to bring it down. Marshal Rebecca Stone arrived exactly at dawn as promised, accompanied by 6 deputy marshals and a territorial prosecutor. Her first words upon surveying the scene were a mixture of admiration and amazement. Sheriff Hart, in 30 years of federal law enforcement, I've never seen a cleaner resolution to a case this complex. Every piece of evidence preserved, every witness protected, every perpetrator accounted for. Caleb looked at the gavel he'd recovered from Judge Blackwood's body, the symbol of corrupted justice now transformed into evidence of justice restored. I had good teachers, Marshal. My children showed me what courage looks like, even when the odds seem impossible. As the rescued children were reunited with their families and the evidence was catalogued for the trials that would follow, Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known since Emma and Joshua's deaths 15 years earlier. His children could finally rest. Their killer had faced justice, and their courage had inspired the actions that saved other children from the same fate. The Cedar Ridge Men's Club was finished forever. 6 months after the fall of the Cedar Ridge Men's Club, the town had settled into a new rhythm of life, one built on truth rather than carefully maintained lies. The trials had been held in the territorial capital with judges brought in from distant jurisdictions, ensuring that justice could finally be served without the corruption that had poisoned local institutions for decades. Every member of the conspiracy received life sentences, with several facing execution for their roles in murdering children who'd threatened to expose them. The evidence recovered from the Whitmore Ranch proved so extensive that it led to investigations in 5 other territories, ultimately destroying a network of child predators that had operated with impunity for over 2 decades. Sheriff Caleb Hart stood in the town square on a crisp autumn morning, watching children play on the new playground equipment that had been installed as a memorial to all the young victims. The brass plaque at the entrance bore a simple inscription, "In memory of Emma and Joshua Hart, and all children who showed courage in the face of evil." Clara Whitmore was among the children playing, her laughter carrying across the square like music. The transformation in the little girl was remarkable. With proper care from Dr. Mitchell and the support of a community finally willing to believe and protect its children, she'd reclaimed much of her natural childhood joy. She still had nightmares, sometimes and probably always would, but they no longer controlled her life. "She's doing well," Dr. Mitchell said, joining Caleb at the playground's edge. "The trauma center we've established has helped not just Clara, but 14 other children who've come forward since the trials. Apparently our case gave them the courage to speak about their own experiences." The trauma center had been Sarah's project, funded by the seizure of the conspirators' assets and operated out of a building that had once housed Edmund Cross's general store. It served children from across the territory, providing medical care, counseling, and legal advocacy for victims of abuse who might otherwise have remained silent. "Any word from the Henderson family?" Martha wrote last week. "They're doing well in their new home, and Sarah is thriving in school. She wants to become a doctor when she grows up, says she wants to help other children the way you and I helped her." Caleb nodded, feeling a familiar warmth at news of another child finding her path forward after trauma. The Hendersons had eventually returned to Cedar Ridge for the trials, their testimony proving crucial in establishing the full scope of the conspiracy's crimes. Eleanor Whitmore approached from across the square, carrying a basket of fresh bread from the bakery she now operated. Marcus's widow had used her share of the seized assets to establish a business that employed several women whose husbands had been implicated in the conspiracy. Her transformation from frightened, silent wife to independent businesswoman and child advocate had been almost as remarkable as Clara's recovery. "Sheriff Hart, Dr. Mitchell," Eleanor said warmly, "I wanted to thank you again for everything you've done, not just for stopping the monsters, but for helping all of us rebuild our lives afterward." "You found your own courage, Eleanor," Caleb replied. "All we did was make sure you had the opportunity to use it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Tom Bradley, now sporting a sheriff's badge of his own. Tom had been elected to replace Caleb, who decided to step down after 31 years of service. At 61, Caleb felt he'd earned the right to spend his remaining years in peace, secure in the knowledge that Cedar Ridge was in capable hands. "Sheriff Bradley," Caleb said with a grin, "how does it feel to have the most honest law enforcement jurisdiction in the territory?" "Terrifying," Tom admitted, "but also hopeful. We've had inquiries from 3 other towns asking for help with suspected child abuse cases. Word's getting around that Cedar Ridge is a place where children's voices are heard and believed. This was perhaps the most important legacy of their victory. Not just the destruction of one conspiracy, but the creation of a model for how communities could protect their most vulnerable members." Law enforcement officials from across the region had studied their case, learning new techniques for investigating organized abuse and supporting victims through the legal process. As the afternoon sun began to set, Caleb found himself at the cemetery where Emma and Joshua rested beneath simple headstones that now bore revised inscriptions, "Beloved children who died protecting others." Beside their graves, new flowers bloomed, planted by Clara and tended by the community children who'd adopted the Hart family graves as symbols of courage and hope. Dr. Mitchell joined him there, as she did most evenings, both of them finding peace in the quiet reflection that came with visiting the past while building the future. "Do you think they know?" she asked softly. "Do you think Emma and Joshua understand what their courage led to?" Caleb looked out over Cedar Ridge, where children played safely in streets that had once hidden predators, where families could trust their neighbors again, where the weak were protected rather than exploited. "I think they know," he said finally. "I think they've known all along that truth and justice would eventually win, even if it took 15 years and more heartbreak than anyone should have to bear." A year later, when Clara Whitmore graduated from the 8th grade as class valedictorian and announced her intention to study law so she could protect children like Sheriff Hart had protected her, Caleb felt the final piece of healing fall into place. His children's deaths hadn't been in vain. Their courage had inspired others to speak truth to power, to stand up for the innocent, to refuse to let evil hide behind respectability and authority. In the end, Emma and Joshua Hart had gotten exactly what they'd wanted: a world where children were safe, where their voices were heard, and where good people stood ready to protect them from harm. The playground where Clara and her friends played each day stood as proof that sometimes, even in the darkest circumstances, love and courage could triumph over evil and corruption. Some legacies, Caleb reflected as he watched another generation of children grow up free from fear, were worth any sacrifice required to preserve them.